What's going on, YouTube? A few of you guys were asking about my master chain, so let's get right into it. All right, I got this song here. That's the vibe. The first thing I ever do on my master chain is a cut at around 20 to 25 hertz. The human ear cannot hear those frequencies, so there's no point of having this, and it also creates some mud that you don't really need in your mix, and you can get more volume by cutting it out. So you can go steeper with this if you want. I usually stick just with 12, so that works for me. And then the next thing I do is some subtractive EQ right after that cut. So I always start with subtractive and then we get into additive EQ. Also, when you're doing your subtractive EQ on the master chain, I think it's really important to not do too much, -1 to -2 dB at the most. I think if you're going over that, then it's more of a mixing problem. You should just go to the instrument itself and fix it. Moving on, I go to my additive EQ. So what I'm doing here with this mix is actually doing a side boost on the highs. I always think mastering is about getting it as loud as possible, as well as getting it as wide and large sounding as possible to fill that stereo field. Never really touched this. I keep this on almost every beat where it's 6K, it's wide at the top. And then this 80 hertz area, sometimes I move around for the kick. It's just where the thump of the kick is. And so it can really punch through the mix a little more. And it's also pushing just the mono, the mids, if you will. So I like to have that kick, centered, along with some bass in that frequency range centered. So I like this move right here. Next thing I'm doing, which I don't usually do, if I really need to, is soothe. So I think I felt like the snare and there's just too much resonance going on in this area, and I used this preset so long, and thanks for the NS10s. I love this preset, but I'd say 90% of the time I'm not using soothe. I think if you're relying on soothe too much, you should just go in the mix, fix those frequencies, or apply soothe to a certain vocal or synth. But for this master, I felt like I needed it. Next thing I do is more just a superstition thing. This is a Logic stock EQ, the vintage tube. Doing a boost. You can totally copy these settings if you want, but the drive is so low that it's barely, it's not really doing anything. So that's that. Next thing I do is a direction mixer. This is again getting it wide and getting it, mono in the crossover under 200 hertz. I always think for mastering, you want your highs wide and you want your lows centered. So this is helping with that. The spread is, 50 is low, and the spread is getting a little more width at the top end, the high end frequencies above 200. So I think these are my settings. I usually go from 15 to 20. If I really want to go crazy, I go a little more. And this is either at 50, 52. I never really go outside those ranges. So the next thing I do is another Logic stock, is this fat effects. The only thing I have on are the bass enhancers and the distortion. So I think this grit preset, and only at 3%, it adds a lot. These little moves add a lot. And I have at 50 hertz where that warmth is just a bit of a bass enhancer kind of process going on. And yeah, you can totally copy these. These are the only things happening on this. And I think this grit really adds a lot. Next thing I'm doing is a tiny bit of fresh air. This really brings out the hi-hats and the snares. I just like how this sounds on my drums especially. Next thing I do is a little bit of secret sauce. This is called Oxford Inflator. This is a really great tool to get in your mix loud. So what I do is I set the effect to 100 and I put the output at -0.5 just so I have a ceiling. And you just boost this as much until you hit 0. So you never want a red line. If I go too much, it's gonna red line. So as you can see, I'm adding this gain, but it doesn't sound bad. It's a great plugin. So right after that, I'm going into a clipper. This is Sir Audio Clipper. I love this plugin. And basically what I'm doing is I'm going to the soft clip preset, and that just adds 2 dB of gain, so even more loudness, but it's also clipping anything that goes past the threshold. So I'd say clipping is a huge part of getting your master loud. And I also, with my drums, I do a whole drum bus. So all the drums are going to a group, and those are getting clipped and limited. So I have a balanced drum that is feeding into this clipper, which is like the final clipper. And this saturation, I usually have 0, but for some songs, if I want it to more gritty feeling or harder hitting, I'll turn up the saturation. So yeah, you can really go crazy with this. So be careful. And then I always put the ceiling at negative 0.5, just to be safe, so I'm not going too hard. But yeah, I would say this is the key to getting loudness, because basically it's kind of tough to explain, but if you look at your waveform, just even if you print it out on like your Files app or whatever you're listening to, or you see the waveform, if it's super spiky, it's really hard to boost that sound, because then those spikes are just going to start distorting. So if you can get rid of those spikes using clipping, you can boost that audio floor right here. So I call this like the floor. So if you can get your spikes and the floor as close as possible, the louder you can boost it without it sounding bad. So that's where clipping comes in. That's how I explain it. And I'm not a mastering engineer. I've just, I've done years of learning from other people and, watching my own tutorials. And there's a lot of bad advice and there's a lot of good advice, but this is just what works for me. So take it all with a grain of salt. And then right after the clipper, we go into the final limiting. Pro L2 is my favorite. I love the visual and you have a lot of control over it. The key things I'm doing here is, I also always have, the oversampling high quality 8. If I'm going to send it out for like a final song, I'll go even higher, but it just takes a lot of CPU, depends on your computer. Oversampling, I'm going 8 here. I always stick with that. And the output is negative 0.5. I used to do negative 0.1, but negative 0.5 or even negative 1 is really good. So you just have a ceiling of I guess like emergency room. If like a platform turns it up, you'll have a little extra safety net for clipping. You don't want to just go to 0. So key things I'm thinking about here is I'm thinking about the gain reduction. So I will never go past negative 3 or 4. Some people go to negative like 6 or something, but I just think it starts pumping and sounding bad. So you want to boost your gain until it's like negative 2. And again, that's taking that floor and those peaks and getting it closer. So that's the game of mastering, in my opinion, and how I think about it is getting those spikes and getting that floor, spike, floor, getting those close together. And that's the best way I can explain it. So this is, again, taking those spikes off and getting that big, large sound. Like I know some people master to the point where it's just a block, like a wave block, and I honestly really don't like that because I just feel like it's too tough to listen to and there's like not as much dynamics. So mastering is just a fine like line of just getting the sound to be dynamic enough where there's like parts where when the drums come out it's low volume, and then when it builds up it's big, but it's not too big where it's distorting. So it's this whole game. So yeah, I could go into crazy detail on that, but another thing is the attack and release, I think, are really important with the final limiter. Sometimes I'll add a compressor before the Oxford Inflator. I use vintage Opto, and I just use the stock Logic compressor. And I'm basically going around 30 to 40 attack. If you go too close, like too fast, your kick will get cut off. And to really hear compression, you just turn this way up. Let's like, if I go all the way, the kick is gonna get destroyed. And then if I let the kick come through, it's gonna have the kick. So just be careful. I always go around like 30 to 50 for the attack on a master compressor. And of course, you don't want to be doing too much. You want to do only like 1 to 2 dB. Like I would stick there. And I'm at 2 to 1 ratio, and then the release depends on your song and your feel. So I think I like to have it groove with the BPM of my song. So I'll go to ChatGPT and just go, all right, final compressor setting for air. I'll do it right now, actually. So I'll go to chat and do final master compressor attack and release for BPM 93. And then you can of course put like hip hop or whatever genre, I don't know. This feels kind of like cheating, but it gets you in that ballpark. So as you can see, 320 is a 16th note at 93 BPM. I would go a little faster because I like the tighter. I'd go to one, so like you're in that range of like, all right, 160 to this is gonna work. And then to really hear the compression, you turn it way up and then you can see where it's pumping or not. That's how I hear compression. And that's using like ChatGPT or some calculator with the BPM is a great way to do it, especially with dance beats where you want that compressor working with that tempo. That's at least what I think about it. I think I'm going way too in depth on this, that it needs to be, but use tools like ChatGPT for that. And then I do the same thing for, you know, the release on the final limiter. The same thing. You can turn it way up and see if it's pumping or not and see if it's grooving. It's really, you gotta like, if you want your master to sound great, you have to think about these attack and release times. I always keep the attack, you know, 1 because on the final limiter, you're limited in it. You don't want like your kick to just not get limited. So you want it fast on the final limiter. And it's not like a compressor, very different. So the limiter I have at 1 ms, I usually never change that. And then the release is usually around like 80 to, could be 200 on the release. It just depends on the song. For the styles, I really like punchy and modern. Aggressive if I'm going to something really hard. Look ahead is at 1. So it took me a while to understand kind of what this channel linking thing is. Basically, it's your like left and right information, like the panning you have. If you want a super wide mix, I'll just dumb it down super like crazy. If you want a super wide mix, turn these down a little bit. It's gonna treat each left and right channel, it's gonna limit it differently. So if one side is really loud, it's gonna maybe tame that differently than the right. I think I'm explaining it right, but basically if you want wider, go lower here. But if you want it sounding, you know, solid, it's gonna limit both channels at the same time. I would go closer to like 100 or even 90, 80, or just mess around with that. It's super hard to hear. I'm struggling to hear this difference, but apparently if you go a little wider, you can get more loudness by different channels limiting on different values. So, and then the target LUFS, I'm always targeting -10-ish. -9 can be cool, but if I go past, or if I go like -8, -7, it just sounds too much, especially when you try to give it to an artist. It's really important also to master for the chorus, just because that's going to be like the loudest part of your song, and that's kind of the, you know, catchy part usually. So as you can see, I'm hitting -11 mostly, which means I could push this harder and maybe gain reduce to -3, or even push the Oxford Inflator. But I just thought that the pumping was too much, so I'm just gonna say, okay, it's fine at -11, -10. I would like to go like 1 dB louder, but it's just a beat. I mean, no one's gonna hear that -dB difference, and I like the dynamics of this one, so I kept it here. So that's basically the master chain that I use on every single beat. The only thing that comes and goes is maybe I'll use compressor, maybe I'll use soothe, but this right here is the chain that I use. And yeah, all the plugins I'm using, I'll put a link in the description. Hope you learned something or got clarity on something. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. Got a lot of plans for 2026. Thanks for watching.